America considers placing troops on the Canadian border, and scientists begin to trace back the origins of the coronavirus. I am Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Today we'll be talking strictly about the coronavirus, but before that I must give a preface. I'm getting quite tired of talking about it. It's become boring to me. I've already said all I want to say about the topic, but unfortunately, that's all there is right now in the news. Therefore, here we are. So let's start with our friends down south, America. According to the Globe and Mail, America has pulled back their suggestion of posting troops at the Canadian border. That's good. That was a stupid idea to begin with. Does America know how long the American-Canadian border really is? They plan to monitor about 30 kilometers of it. And actually, let's talk about the rationale for this. Why did America all of a sudden want to place troops on our border? Presumably, they were worried about the coronavirus. They didn't want Canadians to be bringing it in to America. Well, the logical person would say they've already taken precautions against that. The border is currently closed. America, though, given their nature, is more concerned with the illegal border crossing, though, which really doesn't happen that much between America and Canada in the first place. So yes, let's go back to the idea here. They wanted it to try and curb the coronavirus. Is that effective? I think not. Do they know how long the border is? For you to police only a small fraction of it. If we assume that there really is an issue with illegal migrants coming from Canada into America, they can easily circumvent you by moving an extra kilometer away from your radius. It's not that big to begin with. Then, second, do they seriously believe that Canadians en masse are rushing to get into America now, where things are worse than in Canada? You'd have to be a fool to do that. The only logical explanation would be if you have family in America and you can't go there to see them because the borders are closed, but I presume that would be a small fraction of the populace. This is not the typical refugee situation where people are fleeing from a disaster in a country to go to a better place. It's actually the opposite. Canada is doing better than America in terms of strict virus numbers. There are more patients in America. Now, at the same time, is America forgetting that we are supposed to be close allies here? For you to come out of the blue and say we're going to guard and arm a piece of our border to your friend, that's not logical, and in terms of international relations, it's a terrible maneuver. You can't have one partner or ally calling all the arbitrary shots and you expect a strong relationship to form from that. This right here is a nonsensical waste of time, and it's almost insulting. That would be a misuse of critical resources. Canadians are not illegally flowing into America, especially given the context here. What does America think they have right now? Aside from the familial relationship that somebody might put their life on the line to preserve, people aren't going of their own free will into this country right now. It's just not a thing. This does not call for military intervention. There are protocols in place already that we have jointly agreed upon. There are staff at the airports and our crossings as usual who can handle the scenario. Illegal border crossing from Canada is likely the least of America's problems right now, and at that, the smallest of the world's problems as well. I will admit, maybe there are a few Canadians here and there who are trying to get into America for whatever reason, but when you frame that in the context of all the issues going on in the world right now, this is minuscule. It's not worth deploying 1,000 troops to try and police. It's not worth any of your mind space. But, unfortunately, here we were a couple days ago where the White House is actively putting forward the idea of doing it. Terrible. There isn't even any data that anyone can point to justify this idea. There is no stats showing that Canadians are just flocking into America and destroying the country. It's not a thing that's happening. This is just conjecture. It's somebody's emotional feeling, and it holds no water. Now, of course, America backtracked and they said that they are no longer entertaining the idea, but it begs the question, why publicly state it in the first place? Did you not vet the proposal? If you have an idea, I presume you've talked to your advisors about it. I presume you've talked to Canadian officials about it. And if you've done that, presumably the idea will be good enough for you to publicly say. But on the contrary here, they came out, said some foolishness, and then they had to backtrack it. It seems to me as though the idea was never properly debated. It was never properly reviewed. If you had this idea and you talked to your privy council about it, somebody must have had the know-how to tell you, wait a second, what are we really doing here? Are we about to arm the Canadian border in an attempt to cut back on the coronavirus, where this mechanism right here isn't even contributing to the problem that much, if at all, but it still happens. So it leaves me confused. How do the chain of command operate? How are they able to say such nonsense rhetoric and just let it fester? And then they have the ability to call it back. No, they should be figuring out what they're saying before they officially say it, because it leads to confusion, leads to hysteria, and it's just misinformation. If it was never going to happen, why talk about it? In the eyes of many Canadians, they right here have soured our relationship. They've came forward and blatantly displayed it. They don't really care about Canada. They're not holding us in the proper respect. They're going to do what they deem is necessary. But luckily, they pulled it back. But that impression, though, still lingers because they did it in the first place. Did they really think it was a worthwhile idea? I'm still stuck on that. Who in the White House was propping it up, aside from Trump? Who there was backing up this idea? There is zero rationale for it. It's simply not logical. You have to think these things through before you go out in public and say them, especially when they come with international relation baggage. If you want to damage or hinder your ability to work through a pandemic with your allies, this is one way to go about it, by alienating them. Now, the Globe reports that Canadian officials strongly urged against the idea from the start, and that's the correct stance here. Why do we even need this? It makes zero sense. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland gave this quote, "We are very directly and very forcefully expressing that in Canada's view, this is an entirely unnecessary step which we would view as damaging our relationship." I agree with that 100%. That's the truth. There is no necessity in this action here. It's simply madness, and at the same time, you're treating Canada as a secondary stakeholder here. You are not taking into account what we're saying, and you're simply disarming the border for what seems to us as a nonsensical rationale. Of course, they pulled it back, but I'm still stuck on the idea that that was even on the table to begin with for some time, despite our opposition and there being no data to validate the approach in the first place. It's just nonsensical. Some details of the plan got leaked, and they're as follow. America was planning on deploying 1,000 troops across a 30-kilometer strip on our border. They would be equipped with sensor-based technology to track unauthorized crossings, basically illegal crossings. And the sensor would alert the officials, the soldiers, and they would go and apprehend the people crossing. It's funny to think of Canada in that image, to imagine that Canadians would be doing something like that en masse to the point where you need 1,000 troops to shut it down. It's just not happening. It's a figment of their imagination. I just don't know what concept they've conjured up of our nation to suspect illegal crossings to be a true issue that needs a crackdown at this point in time. In fact, the article from the Globe and Mail writes that it's the opposite. Far more Americans cross into Canada than vice versa. The issue, if we're going to take it seriously, which I think we shouldn't, well, based on the data here, that there are more Americans going into Canada, Canada should be the one shutting down that border with military. If you want to follow the logic, I don't think it's a good idea either way, but playing devil's advocate there. So maybe, though, it's a tactic on America's behalf to keep Americans inside their own country by putting soldiers there who are presumably there to stop Canadians, but in reality, they're there to stop both parties. They want to keep Americans in too. And they're just framing it like this because they don't want to come off as trying to contain their own people. They want to avoid criticism. That's one way to interpret it, but even then it still comes across as a mismanagement of time. It's just not the most pressing issue to be handling right now. There are thousands of people who are dying, literally, within the country and across the world. And we're trying to shut down a 30-kilometer strip of border between two allies? Get your priorities together. Now, there are vast possibilities here as to what America was planning or not planning, but they don't make that much sense in general. From a diplomatic standpoint, the American-Canadian relationship dates back many years, many years, and straining that over a madness concept of what's going to help curb the virus is vastly inappropriate. We've seen this last year too, where the American government was hitting us with tariffs on our steel, and that's also a rather ridiculous move here because we're not fighting each other. We're not trying to one up. We are supposed to be friends. America needs to cut the crap with Canada. Our leadership needs to continue to demand respect from them. We're in this game together. We are allies with the same goal. We don't want anyone to die from corona. We don't want to destroy your economy either with our steel imports. We're trying to create the best possible game for both of us. I'm glad the White House backed away from this idea, otherwise it would have been another serious strain on our relationship, on our ties together, and I don't want to see that. We've realized great success together for decades, and to undo that in a matter of a couple years is just folly. Now, on to Corona update number 2. In the United Kingdom, they've made it illegal to deliberately cough on emergency workers. This is likely in response to a series of, what would you even call them, pranksters, who have been looking to get a quick laugh on their YouTube channel. In America, a woman, for example, was coughing over an entire grocery store, and she caused them to throw out over $30,000 worth of food during a time where food shortages are actually occurring. That's just insane. But still, she did it. So it seems the UK is being active here and trying to police this and curb people from doing rather silly things, making it clear that it's not the time for games, really. And if you want to be acting like a fool, we're going to put you in jail. I think it's tragic that this even has to be mandated by law. People at a fundamental level should realize the scope of the situation and act responsibly, but they're not doing that. Are people really that insane? That's the question I've been asking myself. To have control over your faculties and to cough on people or on food at a store, or to be pretending that you have the coronavirus to scare people around you. It's madness. In combination with the hoarding and opportunism that we've seen, we've gotten a glimpse at the dark side of humanity, powered by what I would consider to be fundamentally greed and a lack of regard for your neighbor. For you to go to a store and clear out all the hand sanitizer and all the masks and then to try and flip it for 2 times what you paid, when there are people out here who are vulnerable and might die due to a lack of supply for the items that you're holding, that's terrible. You put profits over the lives of your community. And for you to be going around and coughing on emergency workers to spit on their face, basically, while they're out here putting their lives on the line, trying to save you, what kind of disrespect is that? Then, on the other level, to go into a grocery store and to try and pull a prank or whatever by coughing on all the food, that's just insane. And you cause a loss of $30,000, you should pay for that. You and your actions have led to such terror and destruction. Maybe that is terrorism in a way. Who knows? It's just crazy though. And we're seeing more and more of these stories each and every day. So now countries aren't playing anymore. They're putting into law the consequences for these actions. Now, in the UK, pulling one of these stunts here, like coughing on a worker, can get you jailed for up to 2 years. Imagine that. You're in the state jail, and people are asking each other what you're in for. One guy's in for murder, one guy's in for theft, and they get to you, you coughed on somebody. Now you're here for 2 years. You're going to look pretty stupid. In fact, Canada has also taken legal measures as well. But they're trying to ensure that people will remain in isolation when they come back from traveling. Under this Canadian Quarantine Act, if you don't self-isolate for 14 days after coming back from abroad, you can face a fine, get this, up to $750,000 or jail for 6 months. If it was up to me, I had to choose one of the two, I'd probably go with the jail time. 6 months, $750K. I would never make that much money in 6 months anyways, so time is better spent in jail than going completely bankrupt. Now, those are rather steep. If you did somehow get caught for violating your self-isolation, it likely wouldn't be anywhere near that. I can't imagine the government really giving somebody a $750,000 fine, especially if they're just a regular person, a middle-class citizen. That would literally destroy their finances. And yeah, it wouldn't be a good look for the government. But this right here is more of a fear tactic. Hopefully it motivates some people to comply with their isolation requirements. If you know that's possible, hypothetically, to go to jail for 6 months or get fined that obscene amount of money, you might be motivated to just stay home. The goal here really is to just limit the spread to whatever degree possible that we can of this coronavirus. If we don't want an onslaught of cases that would cripple our healthcare industry, this is the best way to do it. Social distancing and self-isolation. Preferably, we would take a small jump in cases that are manageable versus everything at once. You can think of it as spreading your payments out for something you bought over a longer term versus having it all concentrated. If you have a limited bank account or resources, it's easier to deal with. If your bill is $100, you can pay $10 each month for 10 months, or would you pay $50 for 2 months? If you only make $20 per month, for example, it's far more beneficial to you to spread these things out over a longer term. Now, on to our last piece today. A study presented or posted by nature.com. They're trying to crack down on the science behind how this coronavirus became present within humans. The strongest theory right now links back to a wet market in China. There were a variety of animals there being sold and slaughtered, and some people say, oh, China has banned that now. Yeah, so now we want to start believing what China tells us? I want to see the proof to that. They've banned many things in the past, even wet markets of sorts, certain animals being sold, but they still exist. We need action, not slogans. We don't need propaganda. Now, this study finds that bats act as a form of reservoir host for the virus, and that basically means that they have these coronaviruses in them, but they can't pass it directly onto a human. There's a form of barrier there. In fact, they need a middleman, a medium, to do that transfer. So, which animal orchestrated that exchange for us? Right now, it's officially unknown. The entire picture hasn't been fully parsed out, we're just speculating, but the report finds that pangolins seem to fit the description, and those animals were sold at these markets as well. They're capable, and they were there. Seems somewhat likely, although it's not certain. And if you've never seen a pangolin before, I suggest you Google it. They are quite unique. They've got these cool scales on them. I believe they're some type of anteater. They kind of look similar to an armadillo, but more prominent. They're just way cooler. And it turns out that within these animals, they have a strain of coronavirus that is very similar to what is plaguing the earth right now. With a little bit of mutation, it's possible that the original virus came from these cute creatures. It started in the bats. Somehow, some way, it entered the ecosystem of the pangolin, and from there, a human somehow came into contact with that. Maybe they were the middleman. That's the going theory. We don't know for sure. And of course, there are so many theories out here as to what happened. The most interesting I've found is a conspiracy theory that somewhere in America, the coronavirus was invented and created, and that's the origins of it. It sounds quite like propaganda to me. If you want to put forward an outlandish proposition, I'm not saying it's wrong. We don't know the full story yet, but if you want to create a crazy idea, you better have proof to back it up, not simply a gut feeling. Because if it's just a gut feeling, you are on the tier of anti-vaxxer in my mind. You need evidence to support this. You need some type of science or proof to narrow it down, because if we start playing this game, this conspiracy game, literally anything is valid. It's a nonsensical argument to be making. I could say, hey, the coronavirus began in Canada in a lab that was secretly formed by the RCMP, and they were testing it on mooses and penguins, and somehow, some way, it spread to China and whatnot, and that's what happened. Maybe, but likely not. Do I have evidence for that? The answer is no. So how did I come to it? Strictly based on imagination, maybe, or propaganda, or trying to further my agenda. We cannot operate based on these standards in the world. The going evidence here suggests that it was formed in China, and the chain of command seems to point towards an animal to human transfer. Anything contrary to that, we need evidence to back it up. You might be right, but show it to us. What is your rationale? That's all I ask for. Now, back to this pangolin and wet market thing in China. What do we do about it? First of all, it's very clear that not all animals are equal. Some animals pose a greater threat to humanity by ingesting them. This is not true for all of them. You can be relatively safe eating a chicken. Having a pangolin in combination with a bat nearby, that seems to be more risky. You could induce a coronavirus-like pandemic around the world. Even with a chicken, it's possible, but the risk, the degree of uncertainty with certain animals is far too high to justify you eating it. Some of these things have to be rooted out, and it's not simply just a decree that China and other places have to make. They have to actually enforce it, because you can ban the pangolin trade, but there's a whole underground syndicate that's based around selling and distributing these animals here. It's not simply enough for you to say stop doing it. You have to make sure that people stop, because we see the consequences of these actions here. Now, when I say this, I encounter an interesting counter-argument. People will hit me with the moral relativism. They'll say, hey, that's part of their culture. We're not able to judge that. If they want to ingest certain species of animals, because we don't do it, that doesn't give us grounds to hate on them. We don't have the moral authority to tell them not to do it. And my response to that is no, open your eyes. The reality is some animals are more risky than others. It doesn't matter if it's in your culture or not. That is not justification for your actions. It matters in the realm of logic. You have to reason through it. Is it a safe practice when you consider the global health and your society? Is it a sustainable practice to be committing? I don't care if you grew up on it. I care about the effects of such a thing. If we are convinced scientifically that wet markets are a breeding ground for disease, if we are convinced that certain animals harbor a coronavirus within them and they can transfer it to humans, it doesn't matter if 1,000 years ago your ancestors were eating it. It matters here and now that it is no longer rational. You have choices. You have options that are far less risky. You should make use of them. This line of argumentation is simply a fallacy wrapped up in a veil of tolerance. It just doesn't apply onto the real world. If Westerners who really enjoy eating their beef encountered a mad cow epidemic, I'd be telling them the same thing too. Stop eating cows right now because it's no longer safe to do so. I don't care where you are from. To me, it matters what the outcome is of these actions here. For people not to even be on the same page about that really indicates just how deep our polarization has spread. To not be on the same page about ensuring these coronavirus pandemics don't occur again in the future by curbing the mechanism at which this one spread is just asinine. And in what manner are we defending these wet markets and these animals? Because it's part of the culture? Who cares about that? If you want to do the reductio ad absurdum, you can look at a community of cannibals there. That may be their culture. That may be what they've grown up knowing for whatever it is their history stems back to, but it does not justify their actions in the here and now. It's not a valid rationale. Just because you've done something for a very long time does not mean it is moral or correct to continue doing so in the future. I've been saying this message ad nauseum for a long time now. You have to employ logic in your decision-making criteria, or you fall victim to the whims of complete uncertainty in everything that you do. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at PerryPlatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.